Hello, my name's Ron Lugbill, and I want to present to you a little bit about some of the research in second language acquisition, about learning a foreign language. So let me get right into it. These are a little bit random research that I found on the internet that, however, I would say that I didn't cherry pick. I tried not to cherry pick. There's some that are from a comprehensible input um, sort of approach, but many of them are not. And so let me just go through. This is a comprehensible input and learning outcomes. It's kind of a review of some different research, and that they analyzed some studies about pre-modified input, and so that is whether you use native materials, something that was written or designed for native speakers, or something that's been modified so is at a lower level, because foreign language learners usually have a lower vocabulary, a much lower vocabulary than a native speaker, unless they've been studying the language for many years. If they've been studying it for 10 years, they might, or if they live in the country, they might have developed. All right, so some of the conclusions on this review is, there's two different approaches. One is to modify, and the other is interaction. And there were three studies I looked at, and from 86 is the Pica, Dowdy, and Young, the Laschke study from 1994, and Ellis in 1995, and that they didn't find either positive or significant evidence for considering the pre-modification of input as a key factor on comprehension and on acquisition when compared to interactionally modified input. But Gass and Veronis demonstrated that negotiation was a facilitating factor on input comprehensibility. There was another study that also found through interaction, learners achieved higher levels. Interaction is, say when you have a conversation, that you get to clarify what the other person said. You may not realize it, but we do that often in conversations, because often our conversations aren't that precise. Anyhow, that there's a little communication gap, and so you do some clarification. But they say that the effect of interaction on acquisition remains controversial. Ellis in 1981 suggests that comprehension does not necessarily lead to acquisition, and several other authors corroborated that. There may not be a direct relationship. There might be an indirect relationship between negotiation and acquisition. In other words, like having interesting conversations, you may start to detect, oh, there's a difference between the way the native speaker said it and the way I said it, and so that might lead to more acquisition when you can find those differences. Long also suggested that negotiation indirectly promoted second language acquisition. And then there's a question of degree, as if interaction does facilitate second language acquisition. Does that? How much is that? So it kind of ends that we need more research in that area. Let me look at another one here. Okay. This one's really not in the area of second language acquisition. It's just the effect of daily read alouds on students' sustained silent reading. And this is really in a first language context. However, I must say that we often think of them as very different things, but really comprehensible input, second language acquisition is not that much different than the first language acquisition. You're acquiring a language. The difference might be that in a second language acquisition, when you're reading second language acquisition, you may not know a lot of vocabulary, whereas in the first language, you might know. But first language learners learn a lot of vocabulary through the reading also. And that this research found that there was evidence of a change in the students' ability to sustain silent reading and their enjoyment of silent reading based on the teacher read-alouds. That the students started building some reading stamina through doing daily silent reading. That the impact in just a 2-week period of doing read-alouds showed that there was some improvement in terms of reading stamina, and also that the read-alouds and the study was really about the effect of read-alouds on the students' sustained silent reading. So there was some effect on that was beneficial. I think that the two kind of go together. All right, this is a study of the effects of teachers reading aloud versus as opposed to student silent reading on comprehension. And in English as a foreign language context, in other words, where someone's learning English in a non-English speaking country. And the conclusions were, this was a 2019 study, and Kamaloglu and Ayer. And the study implies that students' silent reading can be preferred over teachers reading aloud in EFL classes when reading informational texts. But that there was no significant difference between teachers reading aloud and students' silent reading conditions and surface level comprehension. Yet students' silent reading was found to be significantly more effective than teachers reading aloud in deep comprehension. The one difference in the silent reading is the student is able to go at his or her own pace, whereas the teacher sets the pace for a read aloud, and that the student can kind of, they just read the sentence but they didn't really understand it. They can go back and reread it if they want to. They can kind of adjust things to fit what works for them, and so that there was a difference in a deeper level of comprehension. That said that the teacher's reading aloud can be used as a bridge in comprehending the text at a surface level, which could then be followed by student silent reading for in-depth comprehension. So they suggest reading a text aloud first, and then having the students read it silently, so that then they will understand it better. So that's one approach. This is something about Paul Nation is a second language researcher from New Zealand. It's kind of an expert, especially in the area of vocabulary acquisition. And he has the 4 strands. That's his recommendation based upon all the research that he's read and done. And so there's the 4 strands are: 1, meaning for focused input. That can be both reading and listening, where the students are not focused on form, but they're just reading for the content, the reading for the meaning, or listening for the meaning, not listening or reading for to illustrate some grammar point or something like that. The second one is through deliberate attention to language items and language features, like attention to the sounds and spelling of the language, the grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, that sort of thing. The third one is meaning-focused output, that is speaking and writing, where your attention is focused on the meaning of what you're trying to say. It's not focused on how to say it. It isn't focused on the grammar or pronunciation. That those grammar pronunciation would be under category 2. This is category 3, which is the output. And then category 4 is fluency development. That learning to read fluently, learning to speak fluently, learning to write fluently. That it's in every area of language use, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and more fluently. That he's done some research in this area of fluency, and he feels that that's important. And so each of these 4 strands, the meaning focused input, attention to language details, the meaning focused output, and then the fluency, he says, because there are 4 of them, each should take up 1/4 of the time in a language course. Of course, different people have different ideas about this, but that's what he comes to based on his reading the research, and that he does talk about fluency development activities. He likes this 4-3-2, where you might have the students with partners, and first they talk about something that happened in 4 minutes, and then they talk about it in 3 minutes, and then they talk about it in 2 minutes. So they have to kind of say it faster each time. And similar sort of thing with writing. With reading, that he'll time the students reading a certain passage. While they read a certain passage, he'll put the time up on the board every 10 seconds. And then when they're done, they just look up at the board and see what their time was. Of course, now you probably do it with all cell phones have stopwatches on them, but some teachers don't want to have the students using their cell phones. So anyway, that's something else that he encourages and is often overlooked in language. Personally, I don't see it taking up 1/4 of the time of the course. That sounds like a lot. But that's what I would put more emphasis maybe on the input. Let's look at some more research here. This is from 2020. Zijing Feng. This is about 2 different forms of language acquisition. That is explicit vocabulary learning, and using digital flashcards, and extensive reading, where you just read silently. And he is sort of I think he's originally a proponent really of the comprehensible input approach, where you just get lots and lots of input. However, his learners, this is interesting, sort of preferred to do a more explicit approach to doing the flashcards. And so he proposes in the summary to do both. He says his literature review claims that extensive reading in conjunction with intentional vocabulary learning through a spaced repetition flashcard system is effective in improving English learners' vocabulary knowledge. So this is really a review of the literature as opposed to a study. Evidence that supports this claim includes scholars in second language acquisition agree that extensive reading is effective in improving vocabulary knowledge, and B, learning activities focused on vocabulary knowledge can consolidate learners' vocabulary knowledge. C, spaced retrieval practice benefits retention of information. And D, digital flashcard software that employs spaced repetition practice can be used to improve learners' vocabulary knowledge. This claim and body of evidence addresses effective vocabulary acquisition strategies by English reading and learning vocabulary knowledge relevant to the reading material with a spaced repetition system. This field project intends to provide a curriculum of how to implement extensive reading with the use of spaced repetition flashcard system to improve English learners' vocabulary knowledge. That there's been an emphasis in the research, which hasn't really been translated to practice, of vocabulary as being the emphasis in second language acquisition, as opposed to there's kind of this dichotomy or a sort of a controversy between skills or grammar-based instruction and comprehensive input, and but in the research has been maybe more of a tendency to just look at vocabulary acquisition, and that the vocabulary acquisition should be done normally in a context. That the extensive reading is good for vocabulary acquisition because it is done in a context, and that it's retained well because it's acquired in that context. But the comprehensive input people would not be as supportive of doing, say, a flashcard system in order to learn vocabulary because it's not as retained as well. My view is sort of in agreement with this review of the literature, and that is that you do some of both. You do explicit vocabulary, and you also do the implicit vocabulary through reading. Because in order to learn a word, you need to see it in a variety of contexts. You need to see it multiple times, at least 10 or 20 times, in order to really acquire that language and that vocabulary. So, and often in classes, well, here's something else that I think is important in textbooks and classes. We often teach vocabulary in units. For example, we learn like all these different sports. We learn like swimming, running, tennis, basketball, whatever, and one unit. And then the next unit we'll learn the clothing. We'll learn like shirts and pants and socks and shoes and dresses and coats in the next unit. And then following unit, so we have like these units where we're learning like things. And the research says not to do that, actually, that it confuses learners sometimes, that they're like, oh, was that the word for judo or was it karate? I can't really remember. And but if you learn it in context and you learn them separately, that it's just retained better. That's the key with vocabulary, is the retention. That people often learn a lot of vocabulary, but then they forget it. The other aspect that is often not done well in classes or courses and textbooks is that the vocabulary should be really based upon frequency. That a lot of times, have like this list, and it's usually a bunch of nouns, and nouns are much less frequently used than pronouns, adjectives, verbs. That you really need to know those. You need to know verbs well, and just going on a frequency basis. What I try to do is I learn vocabulary with bilingual sentences. One sentence in the target language, one sentence in the student's native language. If you're in a situation, say English as a second language situation, where you have multiple different languages, then or if you just have advanced learners, you can do your definitions in English. That if the students have enough vocabulary that they can understand dictionary definitions, you can teach it to them just as you would to native speakers, because dictionaries kind of use a limited vocabulary, maybe 3,000 words or so, in defining things. So once the students have a 3,000 word vocabulary, you can move on to using target language only. However, I think the research says that it's the students do better with bilingual definitions, and it's better to have those bilingual translations of vocabulary, and it's better to have those in sentences than individual words, because that puts it in a context. I go a step further, and I take those sentences out of a dialogue, and we read the dialogue together, so the students, when they're reading this, they might also remember a dialogue is a story. It's a little something that happened between two people and they're talking, and so the students might actually recall a little bit of the story, which puts into context. Your brain likes things in a context, and your brain kind of shreds things that are not in a meaningful context. That's why Paul Nation says to both your input and your output in meaningful context. That if you do things based upon grammar points or whatever, it's like, oh wait, we have to do a sentence to learn the present progressive tense or something, that it may not be meaningful to the students. But if you just say what are you doing, or that it's it puts it in a more real context. Your brain likes real meaningful things and tends to retain those better than things that don't have meaning. So and a story will put things in a context. Or asking about the real life. What did you do over the weekend, or what are you going to do this weekend, or that sort of thing. That is real communication. Your brain tends to retain real communication a little bit better. Let me look at this. This is some information about the comprehensible input hypothesis and comprehensible input instruction, and this is, let's see. Kind of a review of some of the literature. It's from a comprehensible input perspective. So it says that there. This is. I'm sorry, I don't have the site, but it does have some sites within it. It says that there's no evidence suggesting that the following legacy language practices are effective: grammar, teaching, and practice; forced and or early output, making students speak; any kind of drill; error correction or recast don't work; minimal reading, fragmented one-dimensional reading; lists, informational text, in other words, things that are out of context; or sequenced grammar instruction. And it says that languages are acquired only when people get oral or written comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is really messages that the learner understands, that's somehow made comprehensible through a context, through gestures or pictures, or through translation. Comprehensible reading in the target language improves acquisition a lot. Grammar practice and explanations, metacognition, performance feedback, and output are minimal or no value. Drills and any other kind of output practice don't work. There are predictable, unavoidable, error-involving stages and sequences of acquisition of grammar which cannot be changed. In other words, you learn grammar in a certain order. First language learners do that. You did that as a child. Children would go through this stage where they, for example, in past tense, they don't know the irregular forms of past tense yet, and so they'll just add ed on everything, and I goed instead of I went. That's an irregular past tense in English, that normally you just have an ed on the end of a verb to make it past tense, but went is it's an irregular form. So a lot of times, and second language learners do the same thing, is they don't know the irregular forms at first, and even if you drill it and teach it, and irregular forms past tense, they may not really learn that. They may not really be able to do it. They might be able to produce it on a grammar test or whatever, right, if you taught it, but a year later, when they go to the country and they got to produce it, that they may not use a regular form yet, because they're just not at that level. They may not know all the regular forms of past tense verbs, and then they got to learn the irregular, and so it goes through this step-by-step process, which, according to Prashant and a lot of these researchers, it can't be changed. In other words, we think like, oh, we taught this so they know it. No, probably not true. Okay. This is interesting. Learners speaking the target language does not help learners acquire it and often slows acquisition. The comprehensible input approach is not to speak it, but until you're ready, until you want to, but to not to have forced early output, forced early speech, to do more comprehensible input methods like telling a story, that reading a story. They do these movie talk where there's some kind of movie that's on, but you turn the sound off, and then the teacher narrates it using simple language in the target language. Free voluntary reading, where you just pick up a book you want to read and read it, and that those are more effective than legacy methods. And despite superficial differences, children and adults learn languages in the same way. That the adults can still pick up a language just like a child picks up a language. And so that's kind of a summary of their points here. I would add that even with some of these drills or something, that you'll be learning something. It's not as effective as it could be, but you're still getting some of the target language. You're still getting some comprehensible input, right, through these pattern drills or whatever you're doing, and so that's not completely ineffective. And also that sometimes that the grammar can be retained for like years. You learn it, say, when you first learn a language, and then years later, it's kind of going through your mind. Oh yeah, right. In the accusative case, I'm supposed to use den, in German, for example. That you learned that a long time ago, and you may never have used it, but somewhere in the back of your mind, and then it may come back up at the point when you're ready to use it at that point. But it's kind of a waste of time, really, when you think about it, because you could have been learning, you could have been reading, you could have been, learning explicit vocabulary and context, and instead you learn this grammar point, which you won't use for years. Anyway, so so this is kind of a comprehensible input approach. Correction doesn't work, and they say there's broad agreement among researchers about effective practice. That they say there's broad agreement on the comprehensible input, and we must provide some focus on form to support meaning, like grammar explanations. So they do this pop-up grammar, and sometimes in comprehensible input, where you just do, it's like, oh, why is there a contraction here? Well, can't means the same as can not. And so you do, a 10-second explanation of that. And they say that there's no transfer of explicit knowledge of grammar to implicit language competence. That the grammar that you learn explicitly, you see, most of your grammar, you may not realize this, but in your native language, in English, if you're a native English speaker, that you just picked it up, right? Your parents didn't sit down with a textbook and teach you the past progressive tense when you were 2 years old, right? You just picked it up. It just happened. And the same thing happens in foreign languages, and that if you try to teach that 2-year-old the past progressive tense, it's a completely worthless thing. And it's the same idea that if you're teaching someone who's learning a foreign language this grammar concept when they're just a beginner in the language, it's kind of worthless. It doesn't really work. This is something else interesting that researchers have found, is that the use of a lot of formulaic expressions, chunks, is essential, especially for beginners. Like, what would be a chunk we would say? Like, I don't know. If you have to go through, it's like, what's the word for I? And what's the word for no? And then how do you negate no? If you have to go through all of those steps, it's very slow and laborious, and it's much easier just to learn the phrase I don't know, especially for beginners. There's a bunch of these little phrases like that, that do you want to, or just little phrases that are little short sentences, little phrases that we use all the time, like all the time. That's kind of a chunk that we use all the time. But if you have to think of the translation of those words individually, and how the other thing is you'll say it in your native, even if you translate each of those words, that it may not, it sounds weird or wrong, it's not correct really, because if you say like all the time, like in French, that might translate into toujours. You can't say tout le temps, and yet that's possible, but it's maybe not as idiomatic as if you just learned the expression, so anyway, and it says instruction must primarily focus on meaning. They don't exclude some focus on form. That's kind of the contrast, is focus on form versus focus on meaning. But they say the instruction should primarily be on meaning. Drills don't work. And some output is necessary for acquisition in much later stages, as this focuses learner attention on some aspects of form. That the grammar and the output are really for more advanced learners, or intermediate learners really. But say in a foreign language class in a high school, when we're talking about intermediate learners, well, we're definitely not talking about a first or second year student. Maybe a third or fourth year, the more advanced third and fourth year students would be intermediate learners. And really you don't get to advanced levels in a language class. The advanced learners would be, except, like maybe in grad school or something, or third or fourth year maybe of college. But basically, advanced students are someone who's been immersed in the language over a period of time, not just once in a while in a classroom, but has lived in the country basically, or has spent so much time immersed in the language, say online or something now, that's kind of a new phenomenon, that people can get immersed in a language online and spend their lives in a foreign language without actually being there. That there's a lot of people who do that, especially with English, is they may work online, and they may be studying in online classes in English, and they may have a bunch of relationships with other people that are online and are in English, and so a lot of their lives, most of their lives may be in a language that's foreign to their country, and they may not have ever actually lived there. Anyway, here's some things that they sort of refute. They say that learning styles or multiple intelligence do not exist. That was a popular theory, and it's still popular. Still, some people will say, I'm a visual learner or whatever, and Van Patten, researcher, and some others say that there's no research to find that these learning styles and individual differences are involved in language acquisition. And here's another thing. This is sort of interesting. Do students like speaking in a second language class? Generally, no. Um, that speaking has been found to be the most anxiety-provoking form of communication. That's one of the hypotheses of the um, it goes along with comprehensible input. One of Krashen's hypotheses is the affective filter, that you need to be in the right frame of mind where your anxiety level is low. Of course, you're still alert, you're not asleep, but the anxiety level is low, and that you're motivated, and these psychological factors play an enormous role in language acquisition. And so when you put a student on the spot and they got to respond in a foreign language, and their heart starts beating fast, and they're kind of worried about saying things right, it's not a good atmosphere for language acquisition. He says to keep the anxiety low. This is interesting. The production anxiety in classes is high among non-immersion students. And that the best practice is probably to let those who want to talk, and then if the student doesn't feel comfortable talking, just you can just do some symbols to see whether or not they understood. Like I do this 5-finger thing where they, 5 means they understood everything, 1 means they understood nothing, 3 means they got about half of it, 4 means they got most of it, and 2 means they got some of it, but not even half. Does speaking improve acquisition? No. That there are some competing hypotheses with this comprehensible input, or some might be considered complementary hypotheses for the comprehensible input hypothesis. That Swain looked at it's a researcher named Swain, looked at the French immersion programs in Canada, where students, English-speaking students, would go to school all day in French, and they would just bring in French-speaking teachers from Quebec to teach them just the same as they did with their teachers, with their students in Quebec in a regular school. And while the students did really well with the reading and writing and listening comprehension, that their speaking skills were not developed. And so Swain developed this output hypothesis, said that you need to not only do input, but there needs to be some output as well. And this was a study where they taught English-speaking students Spanish structures with various mixes of input and output. Some did only input, some did both, and some did mostly output. And the only input people did very well. But the people who did both input and output did no better than the input only students. And the students who did mostly output did worse than those who got either the input or the mixed input and some output. Especially in the early stages of language acquisition, input is very important, but it must be comprehensible. In other words, if you just turn on the Chinese radio station and start listening to it, there may be a very limited value to that if you listen to it a lot. But you're not getting it, you're not understanding what they're talking about. You might be picking up some sounds, but basically that it's better, say, to watch a cartoon in Chinese, or to have a teacher tell you a story with some gestures and illustrations to give it some context, and probably with some slower speech so that you could understand it. And there's another question: should we speak slowly in class? And they say yes. That learners need a slower speech. Do learners need many repetitions of vocabulary items to acquire them? Yes. They did a study where 160 repetitions on an item resulted in new items being wired in. That, in other words, they're going to retain it long term. Does feedback about performance help acquisition? No. Are some people better than language learners than others? No. Some of the older research said yes, but some of the newer research says that anyone can acquire a language, and but in terms of processing, there's no difference among people. If they get comprehensible input, they acquire roughly the same rate in the same way. But if it's a class that's skill-based that does grammar, then there would be a variety of outcomes, I should say. And do children and adults learn languages in the same way? And they say mostly yes. That we kind of acquire the grammar in the same order, as I said, and they make similar errors. And so there is some research that compares comprehensible input methods to legacy methods, and generally, let's see, this CLAA testing showed the TPRS, which is teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, taught students outperformed other students despite having less in-class time than other students. And also that this other study, Joe Desicek, found that TPRS outperformed communicative teaching, which is a very popular form of teaching where in second language acquisition, where the important thing is to have a communication gap, where they give some students these questions, they give the others a list of possible answers, and then that you learn about the other student from these questions. And even and the TPRS taught students being better in both oral and written output, even though they didn't actually do oral output, that they were just being taught by the teacher telling them stories, basically, up at the board and telling them some story. But that some of the studies were, they did come out about the same, the storytelling approach versus a traditional approach. But usually the storytelling approach does better in terms of testing than the legacy approach. Okay, so that's research regarding comprehensible input and comprehensible input instruction. Let me go. That one took a long time. This is about pronunciation. It's a 2014 study by Thompson and Derwing, and that sort of the older research was like, well, it's hard to teach the pronunciation. It doesn't really make much difference. You spend a lot of time doing it, and they may still not pronounce it correctly. But the newer research says that pronunciation instruction is effective. It does work. That with younger language learners, elementary school, I'd probably not do it. But if it's past puberty, if it's high school, college, or adults, that I depend on the language, but in general, yes, I would recommend pronunciation. That it is effective. That does work. Both teaching like just individual sounds and teaching words and phrases. This is a review of the research, and that a number of these do show that pronunciation, there is some issue about, they call it the critical period before, when as a child, if someone learns a foreign language as a child, they will, if they are immersed in it, they will probably have very good, if not perfect, pronunciation. If they learn it as an adult, they probably won't. Um, Adolescence. Well, anyway, that in general, the older you are, you may need more work on pronunciation. I wouldn't bother with pronunciation if it was, like I said, with elementary age students, or preschool students. Definitely, I wouldn't bother with pronunciation. And most teachers don't teach pronunciation. I don't know if it's because they don't know it, or what the issue is exactly. But I found that in a foreign language context, in other words, if I'm teaching French in the United States and my students don't just pick up the pronunciation. I know some of the comprehensible input people or some of the language teachers might think, oh, well, they just pick it up. What they do is they use the nearest English equivalent. And because of kind of the social structure, the cultural structure that they're in, pronunciation is very dependent upon motivation. If a student really identifies with the target culture, they really think, French and French people are great, and they really want to, go live in France or something, that they're going to be much more motivated and they're going to have better pronunciation. If somebody is, really just taking this class because they have to, because it's required, and they're just kind of going through the motions, and I really don't care about French people. I think French people are stupid, that because their motivation level is lower, that they're just likely to have much worse pronunciation. I gotta tell you on this point that because I found some of the students, they'll kind of make fun of native speakers speaking their own language properly, that they'll do stupid accent or something, and that the entire course can be a complete waste of time if the students aren't learning to pronounce it in a way that native speakers could understand. And so I developed a system. You can develop your own. I didn't actually teach the sounds that much. I did a little bit, but I kind of moved more on to teaching individual words. And then for the first 2 months of French 1, I would give them like a 1-page dialogue, and we would practice it every day in class, where I'd say, I would read 1 or 2 words or a phrase, and they would just repeat after me, and they'd read and repeat, and they'd read and repeat, and so it took like 2 minutes a day every day. And then they were tested on it, and I told them ahead of time, you're going to be tested on this, it's going to be part of your grade. But for the first 2 months, I just graded them on that, is how well they were able to mimic me, so that they learned to mimic me very well, or at least, like I said, depending on the motivation. Some of the students learned to mimic me perfectly, and you see, then that carries over, that every time I'm teaching new vocabulary and we learn the pronunciation, they've learned to mimic me, that they say it exactly the way I do, and they're not just using the nearest English equivalent or mispronouncing it. And and then after the first 2 months, rather than have them, do a read and repeat, that they would just read that aloud to me. And I would also practice all this individually with students. If you don't do it individually, just the core responses, you're not going to get very good results with it. Some of the students will do it, but most won't. And so so they learned how to pronounce French properly. Because French has some sounds that English doesn't have. That they do nasal sounds, that we don't have. Although I find that native English speakers can make those sounds. It's not like something hard, like the French R, that they have trouble with. It's an aspirated R, but native speakers can understand, even if you don't aspirate, if you don't say the R like they do, they can usually understand that. So I didn't actually I don't count off for that if they can't say the R correctly, because I'm really going for comprehensibility. I want them to mimic me, but and there's what was the big? Oh, the U sound in French is maybe a little bit difficult for native English speakers, that we don't have that sound in English, and so the tendency, we kind of have a lazy mouth in English, whereas the French have maybe more muscle tension in their mouth when they say sounds. But anyhow, the sound, oh no, not the it's the U sound in French is something that we don't have, so they would just say ooh, and you see, native speakers won't understand that if they just use the wrong sounds, and so I don't feel like I'm very picky, but they do need to be making themselves understandable to native speakers, because otherwise, what are we doing? We're kind of completely wasting our time. They're not going to be comprehensible to native speakers. It also helps them with comprehension, that they'll understand, what the native speaker, if they can say the sound, then they'll be able to understand it as well. And it's kind of a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But by the end of the first year, I had a number of the first students who they're speaking French like I do. They were making all the sounds correctly, except for the R probably. And even that, they were giving a stab at it. But some of the students were maybe less motivated. Some of the students were not very good readers in English. They probably struggled. They've probably struggled through school their entire lives, and anyway, that pronunciation does work. It does help. This is some research about extensive reading and pronunciation accuracy of English as a foreign language learners. So this is someone who's learning English. This is a study, 2013, from Iran, Malmir and Aragi. And here's what happens with all the reading in English. Silent reading is, or any language, that people subvocalize, and they will mispronounce it in their own minds. And so they're kind of ingraining a wrong pronunciation in their minds. And so I would combine some pronunciation practice, like I was just describing, with the extensive or any kind of reading, so that students learn proper pronunciation. Again, unless it's elementary age students, if they're like 12 or younger, I would probably not. But if they're beyond the age of puberty, if they're high school, college, or adults, I would include some pronunciation practice. Let's see. This is from the California Teaching English as Second Language Journal about pronunciation instruction, how you can achieve it. Kind of English is a second language. In other words, it's foreigners who come to the United States and are learning English in that kind of context. And it says to provide explicit feedback. This is kind of a summary of the research. Studies suggest an important role for corrective feedback. But I do that separately. First of all, I don't call on students to answer in French in class in front of everybody. But if I were to do that, I would not correct their pronunciation in front of everybody. Kind of separate the pronunciation and because normally if I'm just talking with a student in the target language, I would make it meaning based. So it's interaction based on meaning. I don't care if they make some mistakes. It's normal for a beginner to make mistakes, right? That's just what's going to happen, and then they're not going to learn anything from me correcting them, except that they're wrong, they're not doing it. they would just feel bad about it. It discourages them from actually trying, because every time they try, they screw it up. So it says that some types of feedback are better for pronunciation improvement. It says that explicit feedback is very important. But yeah, I do it in kind of a separate area. There is an issue as to whether then that transfers to when they're just speaking for meaning. But if you make it of enough of a habit, if you do regular pronunciation instruction, that should carry over. We do this thing for English language learners, but it's kind of true for every language, is we drop some sounds, we add some sounds. That I think it's important to teach probably explicitly how conversational English is different from written English, because otherwise students won't understand some expressions. Like we'll say "do you wanna" instead of "do you want to." That foreigners, if they're not used, if they haven't heard a lot of spoken English in informal context, are not going to understand something like "do you want to go to the store?" Because the written form is "do you want to go to the store?" If you want to be more comprehensible with your learners, with beginning learners, that you would say things in that kind of way. It's just say things more as they're written, with more spaces between the words, and not dropping sounds and adding sounds like we do. Or what do you want to do? That instead of saying "what do you want to do," we say something like "what do you want to do?" And foreigners won't understand that unless, again, if they've heard a lot of informal spoken English. That's part of the reason why it's super important, I think, to include a lot of informal spoken language in a beginning language class. For some reason, it's like rarely done. But I find that what happens, there's three main problems I find that people have when they go to the country after studying the language for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in their home country. Is one, they can't understand anything because they haven't done much listening to normal conversation. So somebody will say something very normal, like "what do you want to do tomorrow?" And they'll be like, "What?" Like they didn't understand a thing. And then, so it's a complete failure of communication at that point. So the listening comprehension is a big one. The vocabulary is another big one. They simply don't have the vocabulary. Somebody will say some common everyday item, and they won't know what that is. Because native speakers have a much larger vocabulary, that college-educated native speaker might have a vocabulary of 20,000 words. Somebody who's just learning the language, they might have, in a good course, if they're a good student, if everything's going well, they might learn 1,000 words a year. So if they've been learning for 3 years, they might have a 3,000 word vocabulary, which does cover maybe 90% of the words that are used. But then there's still that other 10% they're not understanding, and even that 90% that they have the words for, they may not understand because of the way that it's spoken, because they haven't simply done the language listening that you need to do. And the language listening doesn't just help you with listening, it helps you with acquiring the language. And so it's important. It's very important that the reading is very important. But I would also do a lot of listening comprehension. Like I said, I kind of disagree with Paul Nation. He says one quarter of the class should be the comprehensible input, meaning based input, and so that means like 1/8 of it would be listening, and 1/8 of it would be reading. And in my humble opinion, I would do more like a quarter of each of those, 1/4 reading, and 1/4 listening, or even more than that, especially with the reading, because you just acquire so much through reading that it's just word, 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 word. It's like boom, 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 all in context. And so it's a very effective, very efficient method of language learning. You just get a lot more words per time unit than you would if you're doing drills, or if you're doing, I don't know, some kind of, paired speaking activity or something. Not that, I do like a little bit of paired speaking activity, but I think it is important to do some speaking. I don't start right out. I wait maybe a couple months and then start doing paired speaking activities. But because unlike the comprehensible input people, I've got a whole class to deal with. Every situation is unique. I must say that there's a completely other method of approach to language, and that is the post method pedagogy. Now, this is especially sort of significant in non-English speaking countries, I should say, because what's happened kind of worldwide is there have been it's cultural imperialism, really, is that there are these foreign researchers, European, U.S. researchers who are professors in these universities, and they do language research, and then they disseminate it throughout the world. They go around speaking around the world, and like, this is the way you're supposed to do it. And in different contexts, in different cultural contexts, different religious contexts, different situations, and every situation is unique. And so what works, or what's appropriate in say an American college setting, may not be at all appropriate if you're in Saudi Arabia or China and you're teaching English to beginners in a elementary school, for example. That some things may not be culturally appropriate, some things may, so anyway, the point is that every situation is unique. You need to do what works for you. What I do is, about 2 months into a beginning language course, I would put some sentences on the board, and I do it first with writing. I like to do written conversations between people. It's real meaningful communication, and I find that the writing is a intermediate step towards speaking, and so they can learn to have little written conversations, and they can do oral conversations. So I start out with maybe some writing, and then we move to speaking. We might do the exact same ones, and I let them use the Google Translate on their phones to come up with their answers, so that or they can ask me, or they can consult in the dictionary, but normally it's the Google Translate, and the Google Translate has improved. So anyway, so we do a little bit of that, but I find that after a couple minutes they just start chatting in English or something. So that's it's a short activity, but they do a little bit of output, and because I find that a little bit of output is beneficial as opposed to zero output. If we can spend 5 or 10 minutes doing that, that is helpful. So they can speak, and it's kind of cool. They go into French class so they can learn to speak French, right? And so they get to speak it a little bit and have real communication, a real conversation with their partner. So anyway, that's that study. Let me look at this one. This one is a 2013 study by Xiaolei Zhang at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, comparing the effectiveness of input-based activities and output-based activities on the acquisition of Chinese language. And I'll sum it up here. It's a long study, but um, the outcome is that basically they both work. That output-based production works, but so does input-based. That research of the present study suggests that both input-based activities and output-based activities led to better gains in L2 learners' performance on comprehension and production than learners who receive lecture only. With respect to comprehending the target forms, meaning-focused output activities shared the same effectiveness with input-based activities. Regarding to producing the target forms, so in other words, this is a situation where it's being measured based upon them able to produce a specific grammar principle. And that the meaning-focused output-based activities led to greater gains in second language learners than input-based activities. The key is to design output-based activities as meaning-focused in nature. So for input, it was about the same for the output of this one grammar principle. So if you are doing a form-based approach where you're teaching specific grammar forms and your goal is for students to be able to output it, then including some output in instruction is going to be beneficial. Okay. This is some research from Finland, 2014, by Pietel and Mirakivi, and it's about the impact of free time reading on foreign language vocabulary development. It's kind of reviews some of the research, then has a study. Conclusion is that our results implied that Finnish Comprehensive School can provide a good setting for foreign language vocabulary acquisition, and that the pupils were shown to learn receptively an average of around 700 word families and productively about 400 word families per year during their comprehensive education. Estimations which are in line with previous research on English vocabulary learning in a foreign language context. So they're saying they learn about 700 words per year, 400 of which they are in active vocabulary. We have passive vocabulary which you understand, and active vocabulary which you can produce in writing or speaking. And okay, this is interesting. Yeah, that they compare. There's classes where they learn something in a foreign language, content and language integrated learning, and then there's kind of general education. So the CLIL programs explicitly focus on the learner's thinking skills. So it's not just like rote memorization, but it's like, what do you think of this, kind of deeper level. And then there's also kind of a general, what they call general education. And they found that the students who did the deeper learning with the CLIL, by ninth grade they could comprehend about 6,400 words and produce about 3,700 word families, but the general pupils understand was approximately 5,200 and production about 2,600 words. So there may be some benefit to having deeper understanding instead of kind of a rote memorization of vocabulary. This is Beniko Mason, who's a proponent of the comprehensible input hypothesis, and there's some research she did in Japan where she teaches English, and it's a 1997 study where they found that there's some students that are more motivated than others. Some were only really reluctant English learners, but that the ones who these are students who had failed in English before and they were retaking it, and that the ones who did really free voluntary reading as their entire class learned to enjoy reading English more. And by the end of the semester, they nearly caught up to the ones who hadn't failed the test. And that they did better than the ones that were traditionally taught. This is a 2004 study adding writing to an extensive reading program. In other words, a situation where one group was just doing reading, the other group they added writing to it, and the results were that adding the writing, one group wrote summaries of what they read in the first language, Japanese. Another group wrote summaries in English, and a third group wrote summaries in English that were corrected. All groups improved in written accuracy. There were no significant differences among the groups. And this is interesting, though, that the group that wrote in Japanese did better than the other groups in 5 out of the 6 comparisons. I'm not sure if that was a significant difference, though. The conclusion was that adding supplementary summary writing did not lead to greater accuracy. It was therefore inefficient. It wasn't the best use of time. Really, Beniko Mason's approach is, well, I think for the first 6 months, she just does like oral storytelling. So she doesn't do the writing. Then after that, she does just extensive reading, where you just sit and read the whole class period, because she just found, and she's in a college context, and it's students who've had some English in school before, but are maybe beginning, intermediate. They're not beginners. They're maybe intermediate level in English, and that she, you'll see in this research that she finds that it's just more effective just to be doing the reading, basically. That you can add in these other things, but while you're adding in those, well, you could have just been reading more, is kind of her idea. Now, in my context, because like I said, every situation is unique, I had 90-minute periods, and I don't think my kids were going to be up for reading for 90 minutes. And so we read for 10 minutes. Sometimes more, maybe 15, max of 20 with more advanced students who are more motivated. And I would start out the reading in first year class after the first 2 months. I didn't do it right at the beginning, because there is a danger of them doing fake reading, where they just look at the pictures or something. I had really mainly 3 different categories of books. It's maybe different than what some of the others do. Is I had comic books. I had a lot of comic books in French, which are not like baby language. That some of the language is very difficult in the comic books, but they've got the pictures, and so they can understand a lot from the pictures. And the other one, I had these Disney books, which are really nice quality, and the kids have seen the movies, and so they already know the story pretty much, and now they're learning in French. And they had nice pictures on every page, but the language was not dumbed down. These were not simplified texts, and it was so it's not easy language. But some of the students, a lot of the students would read those because they're familiar with the Disney. I hesitated about the whole Disney thing because it's not the target culture. It's not French culture, really. It's American culture is being exported all over the world. However, all these other cultures are they all know Disney. It's all kind of being adopted by these other cultures, and it does work, in terms of language. You're not learning French culture, but you are learning the language some through the books. And then the other one was the easy graded readers that were mainly written by like American French teachers, and it was that they've got simplified language, so that it might be 1,000-word vocabulary in a book, and that there's a glossary, English glossary in the back, so they can look up any words they want to. And that's what people normally use for the free voluntary reading and language acquisition. But I did some of each of those three categories. And there are a few books that maybe didn't fit a category, but those are the main categories. Anyway, this is another Beniko Mason from Japan study, 2005, that about vocabulary acquisition from listening to stories. But some people say that that's insufficient and inefficient, and that, in other words, Paul Nation says, well, you can learn a lot of words really quickly with these flashcards. The potential problem with that is you won't retain them. You can learn a whole bunch of words, but then you won't retain them. I consider the vocabulary, the explicit vocabulary, like with flashcards, to be sort of a step towards reading. That's why I wanted to wait 2 months. I want to have some vocabulary before they start reading. There are some cognates with French, and it is the same alphabet as English. So, but there's also a danger of, like I said before, of mispronunciation. They'll subvocalize and mispronounce the words as they read. And so I work on pronunciation at the same time, and we don't even start the reading. Well, the free voluntary reading. I actually do read aloud with my beginning students, where I'm reading aloud to them in French, and then I go back and translate in English. Like I read, say, a minute or two in French, and then I go back and translate. With easy text, you can kind of translate on the fly. And they've all got the same text. They're all looking at the same time I'm reading it. So anyway, but they're getting proper pronunciation because I am pronouncing it, right? So they're not, subvocalizing much in the target language. I want them to get used to seeing the word and hearing it at the same time. I found those read alouds where they also have the text to be super effective language learning methods. Basically, what I do a variety of methods in my classes where I will teach explicit vocabulary, and with sentences that come from this dialogue. I'll show the dialogue on the screen, and I'll read it in French and I'll read it in English. Or actually, no, that it's got native speakers reading it aloud, and with their actors, and so they're really presenting the dialogue, and then I'll translate it for them. And so all the vocabulary comes from the dialogue, and I'll repeat that a number of times. So not on the same day, but on different days. So we might see that same dialogue 5 or 10 times. So the repetition is helpful for the comprehension. By the end of, they don't even get it all with the translation, just doing it once. But 5 or 10 times, they got it. Okay. So I do that. I do the vocab. I do pronunciation, like I said, where I read, they read, I read, they read, just little phrases. And so they're, and also with the vocabulary, I teach them pronunciation of it. I read, they repeat after me. I read, plural response. And so, and then I might do a read aloud where I will read for like 10, 15 minutes, and they have the text and they follow along, and I translate, I read the page in English and then translate it. I'm sorry, I read a page in French and then translate it into English. And then, and we might do a brain break at that point. We come back and we do extensive reading, where everyone knows at the end of the brain break, they go and get their book, read it quietly for 10 minutes. And that there might be a few students who are engaged in fake reading, but it's a super effective method. And I read and they read. It's very nice, relaxing time. Students enjoy it usually, for the most part. And then we might watch like a cartoon. And boy, administrators probably hate this, but the cartoons, I think they're super effective. The students understand it just from like the motion, the movements of the characters, and I might translate, or I might put on English subtitles to help them understand it better. But there's this French cartoon called Lou that I really like. The students really like. That we could sometimes we might also watch a movie or part of a movie, or there's or anyway. So we might do that, and then we might listen to a song, and then in French, that provide a translation for that, or just read a translation so that they understand what it's about. But anyway, that's they get some of the French culture that way. In a normal language class, you're just teaching them language structures, and anyway, they get to see like and hear and learn and read what real life in France is like, or sometimes it's not real life, it's cartoon life, whatever, or song life. It's just and I usually show them popular music. I teach them some classic songs like Edith Piaf or something, but a lot of times it's like newer stuff. Like I really like this singer named Pum. It's a young French singer, and Stromae is popular with the kids. He's a Belgian singer, rap, and rap, I don't know, something like that, hip hop. And so anyway, that's kind of stuff we do every day. So we're doing, I think a lot of comprehensive input, both in listening and in reading, and we're doing explicit and extensive. We're doing extensive reading and intensive. I don't know. Is read alouds intensive reading? I don't know. But anyhow, we're doing some read alouds and some silent reading, and we're doing some explicit vocabulary. And I have them all put the vocabulary in their notebooks. Both the English and the French, and I check their notebooks every month, and then they're tested on the vocabulary every month. They learn 50 sentences a month, and I give them a practice test on it ahead of time. So they know all those. So all the sentences are in it. They're normally in a context. They're in a sentence, and so if you think about it, 50 sentences. Say if there's only 3 words per sentence, which is kind of a short sentence, but some of these are kind of phrases like "I don't want to" or something, and but if it's only that would be 150 words that they learn explicitly. That's not counting everything they learn through reading and through listening and otherwise. But 150 words. So if we do that, like, let's see, that'd be like, if we do like 8 of those during the course of the year, like 8 months, they would be learning like 1,200 words explicitly, which is a lot. That's good. Of course, they won't retain all that. What I hope is that they learn this vocabulary and then they see it when they're reading. So, because the thing is, they will lose. That it's kind of a normal thing that you would lose some of the vocabulary that you learned with time. But the most common things will be repeated, and so the key is given just a lot of input, a lot of vocabulary. The first 3 years, should be like super vocabulary rich. That 1,200 words. That's way more than what other language classes do, and they're not even learning high frequency words. They're learning, how to say spatula in French, or how to say, toaster oven in French or something, which are you can have normal fluent conversations about a zillion things and not even know those words in French, and somehow we're teaching them to beginners. And anyway, that they're learning like the most frequent vocabulary. They're learning them in context, and they're also, hopefully getting things reinforced through reading and listening. And so they will have, and I should have put in there, we do, the written conversations and the oral conversations every day too. And so, put some questions on the board, and they can use their phones and have a little written chat with their partners in the target language, and then have an oral chat with their partners in the target language. So they're getting, to use the language too a little bit that way. And so we do a variety of activities, and it works pretty well. They're not going to become fluent in 3 or even 4 years of a language class in high school. That they'll get, if they do well, after 3 or 4 years, they'll be at an intermediate level. And then when they go to the country, or they're somehow immersed in the language, that then they'll advance from there. But we simply don't have the hours. If we have class 180 days a year, well, we don't really. There's always some assembly or something happening, and so maybe 150 days a year. And if it's an hour per class, which often it's not, is going to be, it could be like 45 or 50 minutes per class period, and some of the time would be taken up by other things. But anyway, so you might be getting like 120 hours a year, and really, that's not nearly enough. You're going to need 1,000 hours to be proficient, probably not even fluent. But so yeah, even if you did it like 4 years in high school, you're talking, 480 hours, something like 500 hours maybe. And so you're only kind of halfway there. And of course, the way to increase that would be to give homework. I don't give much homework except things that really can't be done in class. All right, getting back to the research here. Beniko Mason, Japan's 2004. Is form-focused vocabulary instruction worthwhile? So we're getting back to like the vocabulary thing, which I think the newer research is like vocabulary. You got to do a ton of vocabulary, especially beginning and intermediate levels also. Anyway, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to do the exact opposite of the way you should do it. That we do grammar at the beginning, but we should be doing vocabulary, and then we should be doing grammar later. And that's when we're reading, literature in the language from hundreds of years ago or something. So anyhow, 2004, they studied vocabulary growth in English through hearing a story with a combination of the story and supplementary activities designed to focus students on learning the new words in the story. One group heard the story with unfamiliar words, which took 15 minutes, and another story heard a story and did supplementary form-focused activities, which took a total of 85 minutes. Now, the group that did the supplementary activities did better on all measures, including a test 5 weeks later, learning twice as many words as a story-only group. But remember, they did like 100 minutes a day, and then the other group only did 15 minutes a day. And so what they found was that if you calculate it by time, that the story group did better, and they retained it better than the group that did the story plus all these, 85 minutes of supplementary activities. And then there's a study, 2009, Venata, Borsch, and Krashen. It's about Japanese students learning German as a second language. And these others are mainly English. And so this is something that they hadn't learned before, whereas college students in Japan have normally had a number of years of English. The Japanese English instruction is maybe not on par with a lot of other countries' English instruction. So they're still not at a high level in college. But the German, they're just beginners. They don't know any German. And the first experiment confirmed that hearing a story resulted in higher acquisition learning rate than the list method for beginning students of German. All right, instead of learning list vocabulary, that they actually learned more vocabulary from a story. And the second and third experiments confirmed that extra activities, besides the story, weren't efficient, that kind of like the previous. And then there's another study that demonstrated the comprehensible input hypothesis. The combination of reading and listening results in more efficient language acquisition than the combination of traditional learning with a little bit of comprehensible input. So they're saying all comprehensible input is more effective than combining traditional with comprehensible input. 2007 study. This is adults doing self-selected reading and hearing stories. All right. And there's two groups. One was comprehensible input, listen to stories and self-selected reading. The other group did a traditional audio lingual form-based approach. Plus the same kind of reading class. Both groups improved after one semester. But the ones who did the comprehensible input were far greater per hour of time. It was more efficient. The ones that did a traditional approach made larger gains, but they did a total of 126 hours, and the other group only did 18 hours of class time. And so even though the one that did 126 hours, it wasn't as efficient in terms of the time spent. All right, and this is free voluntary reading and TOEFL scores, the English language test for colleges. And the students who did the TOEFL test they were studying for the TOEFL test. They were already experienced language learners because they were applying to go to a college abroad probably. Subjects read for 1 to 4 months and took alternate forms of the TOEFL test before and after doing the reading. The average gain was 3.5 points per week on the overall test. Improvement was seen on all three components: listening, grammar, and reading. This gain is about the same as one sees with a full-time TOEFL preparation class given in the United States and is consistent with previous studies showing that reading is an excellent predictor of TOEFL performance. So these are students in Japan, and they weren't doing any English classes. All they're doing is free voluntary reading, and they gained about the same amount on the test as if they were doing a TOEFL preparation class here in the United States. In other words, they're completely immersed in English and doing a class that was specifically designed for that specific test, whereas the reading isn't. It's just self-selected reading. They're reading novels or something, so it isn't designed to prepare them for the test. There's a 2010 study, impressive gains on the TOEIC. It's an important English test for college and also for work in Japan. They did 1 year of comprehensible input with no output or grammar study. And this is kind of a case study about Mr. Tanaka. He hadn't studied English for 20 years. He was 42 years old. And he made greater gains than the English majors who were taking all these, English classes in school. All he did was just read. Well, he did a story listening class for 30 hours also. So, and his total input time was 247 hours. And I must add here that these comparisons where they say, one class did, one group did reading only and the other did this class. And I guess it depends on the individual, but I find it's more enjoyable to do the reading. I think the research supports this as well, that for the vast majority of students, they'd rather be doing the silent reading than doing some grammar exercises. And the other point they make is that it didn't cost them much. He didn't have to take a class. I guess he did that one story listening class, but there's two groups. At one, they were doing the TOEIC. They were doing English classes. They were English majors, and then he just read on his own. It did like a short story listening class, and he did study some vocabulary on his own. So it's not all comprehensible input. So that he actually did better than you would in a TOEFL preparation course and an intensive English program in the United States. It's like total immersion in a class that's designed, for test preparation, and he actually gained more than they did. So those are some interesting findings as well. I got a bunch more research here to look at, but I think I should wind it up for today. So that's some research on language acquisition and how to apply it. Thank you.